Talking about chapter 23, section 4, the collapse of Napoleon's empire. This man left a mark on the world. His vision was to create a world without borders, to make an empire that spanned across Western Europe and even the Mediterranean. And, you know, the downside of that is, well, what did he really try to do? Yeah, he tried to conquer the world. You know, maybe he, in his own mind, had this idealistic vision for that. But come on. I mean, if you're in England, you're like, these guys are trying to conquer us. If you're in Egypt, you're like, these guys did conquer us. And so on and so forth. And so that certainly doesn't make you popular. And this anger that resulted from being viewed as the conquered actually started the culture of nationalism, and that led to fall. So by 1812, France has conquered all of Western Europe. One exception, Great Britain. They're an island country. They've historically been more difficult to conquer as a result. And so the British have a very powerful navy, and they've defeated the French navy on several occasions. And so in open battle, the French cannot invade Great Britain. So they resort to a different strategy. They're going to starve out the entire country through blockade. And Britain tries to do the same to France. The United States gets caught up in this mess, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, Napoleon also developed a system called the continental system. It was an economic plan, a lot like what the euro is today, that it would tie all the nations of Western Europe together economically. In fact, the United States tried the same thing. It was called the American system. It was an effort to unify the different states in our country by tying them together economically. And so he called it the continental system. But the blockade in Great Britain ultimately failed, because to surround an entire island country can be very difficult. And plenty of people are willing to smuggle. Because, ZK, you can smuggle goods illegally Okay, so I do post these. You can smuggle goods illegally into a country, and because of that, because it's so easy to do, it makes it very difficult to ban anything going into an entire country. And also, Great Britain has the more powerful navy. They responded with a blockade of their own. And it's led by a stronger navy. So the United States in 1812 is a young country. I mean, oh my gosh, a young country. We've only been really a country since 1781. And even then, we had a long ways to go. And so, you know, one of the first things the United States had to do was to begin to establish international trade. Well, it just so happened that France and Britain have been at war basically since America started. And so we've got a serious problem here. So who do we do business with? Well, American presidents from George Washington to the War of 1812 said, we're going to stay out of this European conflict. So what's that mean? France, you want to do some business? Britain, you want to do some business? So we're doing business with both sides. Meanwhile, the entire nation of Spain said, we don't want to be a part of the Napoleonic Empire anymore. We're done. And they rebelled. It was called the Peninsular War. Napoleon sent troops into Spain to put down this uprising. And so we've talked about this several times before too. Even though you have the more powerful army, Great Britain had the more powerful army, but the colonists won their uprising. Why? Because it's very difficult to rule a country that doesn't want to be ruled. even though Napoleon had the more powerful army, the Spanish went underground. They waged a guerrilla war, meaning hit and run, ambush, covert, subversive tactics. And the British were all too happy to help. And so Napoleon lost 300,000 men in this war. 300,000 men. And Spain continued to rebel. And this, guess what, sent a strong message to other places to rebel also. Meanwhile, Napoleon decided to invade Russia. This is like the classic mistake. Russia was unwilling to make peace with the continent of Europe under the reign of Napoleon. They saw it as a threat. And so they were preparing to defend themselves against Napoleon. He tried to handle this diplomatically by saying, can't we reach some kind of peace agreement? And they said, no, you're just going to invade us the first chance you get. We're going to keep a strong army, and we're going to keep it pointed at you because it's a matter of time before you come in here. And so Napoleon's army, guess what? June of 1812, They did go in there with 420,000 men. A huge army. And the Russians realized, we can't fight this army. That's nearly 500,000 people. Oh my gosh. So what do the Russians do? Okay, here comes Napoleon's army. It's basically a giant monster that eats everything. What are we going to do? Well, okay, they're coming for this city. We can't hold that city. They'll kill us all. Let's set it on fire and run away. Yeah, set it on fire and run away. Ha ha. If we can't have it, you can't have it either. It's called scorched earth. So what's that mean? The bad guys are coming to break into your house. They can't if you burn it down. Ha ha ha. They're coming to steal from you. Well, burn your house down. They're going to steal your car. Burn your house down. Or your car. Yeah. It's scorched earth. It's destroy everything because they know they can't win. But they also know that Napoleon's having to maintain a long supply line. And that feeding an army in Russia from France creates logistical issues that make it extremely difficult to leave a standing army in another country. So ideally, you conquer a city. What do? You tell your people to go loot, go steal everything. Hey guys, can y'all just raid that Ingalls over there? And then we'll feed you next week, but you've got a whole Ingalls over there. Not if we set it on fire. Okay, so now you don't have food for your entire army. The Russians are burning everything in sight. Their own country, by the way. Well, finally, keeping the complicated supply line, the million logistics of maintaining 420,000 people in a place, they get to Moscow. They still get to Moscow, the capital city of Russia. I mean, Napoleon still nearly conquers Russia. But at this point, his army is so weakened. If soldiers can't eat, what do? They quit. If they're frozen and they're poorly supplied, what do? They leave. By this point, his army is very small. Small enough to the point that the Russians beat them. They say, we're going to lure this army in. We're going to starve them out. And by the time we finally face them, we will wait until they're weak enough. And that's exactly what they did. So the French got to Moscow. And the Russians set their own capital on fire. Yeah, I mean, scorched earth to a different level. So Napoleon gets to Moscow and he's like, yay, woo, we conquered Moscow. It's on fire. Now what? Well, his men look at him and we're like, we really don't want Moscow. It's on fire. And he's like, actually, I don't either. This place is cold. We're hungry. Let's go home. So he turns his entire army around and goes home. And meanwhile, the Russians are shooting at them every chance they get. They're harassing them. By the end of the campaign, there was almost no one left. Very few French soldiers ever returned to Russia, ever returned from Russia to France. But yet, Napoleon won every battle. But he lost the war. Why? Well, because Russia is daggone huge, and those crazy Russians just burned everything. But yet they never actually beat Napoleon's army in open battle.
The first wave of revolution sweeps through France, and one of the great debates of the age, monarchy versus democracy. On one side sit a privileged few, living in the lap of luxury as they have for centuries. Noblemen and aristocrats are indifferent to the suffering of thousands of their countrymen who've died of poverty and starvation. On the other side, philosophers, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, are spreading radical new ideas about human rights and rallying around the cry, liberty, equality, fraternity. On August 10, 1792, anger in the streets boils over. A mob invades King Louis XVI's palace. With them march sections of the Paris National Guard. From the beginning, it is obvious blood will flow, and Napoleon is there to witness it. Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette, are dragged away to prison. The despised monarchy has come to an end. In 1793, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are marched to the guillotine. Their deaths unleash a tidal wave of blood. Over the next year, during the Reign of Terror, 250,000 people will be slaughtered. The killing triggers the new republic's first crisis, civil war. Thousands of officers resign their commissions. Seizing the opportunity for advancement, Napoleon pleads for loyalty to the government and the revolution.
Fraternité, égalité, liberté. Être toujours les meilleurs.
His allegiance will not go unnoticed.
So things get worse. So Napoleon made a mess of Russia, and he certainly didn't make any friends there. As soon as Napoleon left, the Russian people began to organize and say, we just burned down half our country. We're pretty angry about that. Let's go get those French people. And so they raise a massive army, allied with Britain and Prussia and Sweden and Austria. Well, Napoleon gets home with like 10,000 troops. And he raises another army. I mean, this guy is a natural leader. He's one of the most talented strategists who's ever lived. Remember, he's conquered all of Europe. And so he goes home, having faced defeat in Spain at the cost of 300,000 men, having to face defeat in Russia after a brutal campaign, and he raises another army. But he was defeated because by this point, everyone has ganged up against him. And so he surrenders, and he is exiled to the island of Elba. And so he's on this island under house arrest. He, still gets to keep his he gets to have this really fancy place to live in. He's supposedly writing his memoirs and is going to live out his life in peace because the French people and really the other European powers knew that if they kill this guy, they're going to make a martyr of him, and it's going to cause even more chaos. So they're hoping he's going to chill out at Elba. But he doesn't. He somehow gets off the island, and he goes back to France. And so, the existing French government send the army out to arrest him. And he does this, put me in cuffs if you want. Let me see you do it. And the French army lay down their weapons and kneel before Napoleon and crown him emperor again. And this sets the scene for Waterloo, where once more the British and the Prussians were like, "Are you kidding me? I thought this guy was going to retire." And so in one final epic battle called Waterloo, with one of the most, I can only imagine, a cavalry charge of 6,000 horsemen that the British employed against Napoleon. But just even still, against insurmountable odds, Napoleon still almost won. But he lost at Waterloo, and that was his downfall.
The idea begun by the French in the 1790s would reach its full potential in the vast armies and universal conscription of World War I. In France, men willingly served in the army because the state made them citizens. By World War I, this idea was universally accepted, and every able-bodied male citizen was called to arms. The French army was now based firmly on the notion of equality. Soldiers could rise through the ranks by their talent and ability, rather than social class. This meant that the best soldiers became officers, giving the French army the advantage over opponents who considered aristocratic birth an officer's main qualification. The most talented of them was a young Corsican artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte. His success on the battlefield was phenomenal. And in 1804, at the age of 35, he proclaimed himself Emperor of France.
Napoleon had a Roman relentlessness and ruthlessness. He was in a way a reincarnation of Rome 1,000 years or more after the empire had died. He benefited from the transformation of France into a war-making state immediately after the Revolution. The Revolution turned France into a war-making state.
In Napoleon, the post-revolutionary army found a military genius. Although Napoleon's army was no longer a revolutionary force, it was still an army of Frenchmen, sons of their nation and inspired by their leader. Napoleon continued to promote the best men, regardless of birth. Of his 26 most senior officers before 1789, 4 were sergeants, 3 were privates, and 1 was a bandsman. One of these, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, ended his career as King of Sweden. Radical new officers created radical new ways of running an army. In 1792, the Revolutionary Army created the first combat division, a miniature army of a few thousand men. It combined infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and could operate independently or with other divisions. The divisional system is used today in the U.S. Army and Marines. Napoleon perfected the system. He subdivided his army into individual corps, each with its own commander and responsibility. This is how Napoleon was able to move huge armies quickly. Jean-Pierre Blaise, a corps officer, made a lightning march from the northern coast of France across Europe to Vienna and Austerlitz in 1805.
We were ordered to leave all unnecessary possessions at the depot, so we would be burdened with as little as possible. The rapidity of our march did not permit food supplies to follow us, but we were able to do without bread because we were in the midst of the best season for potatoes in a country where they are very good. How many times did we ruin the villagers' hopes? We stole the product of a year's work.
The speed and foraging skills of Jean-Pierre and his comrades allowed Napoleon to march 500 miles in 5 weeks. Arriving in the east with unexpected speed, Napoleon took the Austrians and the Russians by surprise, easily capturing Vienna and Austerlitz. By the end of 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of the European mainland.